The first time Margaret Holloway saw the children, they were silent, not the comfortable silence of contentment, the kind that settles over a classroom when students are deeply absorbed in their work, nor the tense quiet of mischief being planned, that pregnant pause before laughter erupts and paper airplanes fly. This was something else entirely. Something that made her skin prickle with an instinct she couldn't name, couldn't articulate, but felt in her bones with the certainty of approaching thunder. They sat in perfect rows in the wooden schoolhouse, their small bodies arranged with the precision of chess pieces, their hands folded on desks worn smooth by decades of small palms that had come before them. Their eyes were glassy and distant as fog over the Cumberland River on a winter morning, seeing without registering, present without being there. 23 children, ages 6 to 14, representing every shade of poverty and abandonment that Kentucky in 1856 could produce, and not one of them made a sound, not a cough, not a shuffle, not the scrape of a boot against the floor or the whisper of a question to a neighbor. Nothing, just that terrible, unnatural silence that seemed to press against Margaret's eardrums like water pressure in a dive too deep. Margaret had arrived in Ravens Hollow on a crisp October morning in 1856, the kind of morning where the air tasted of wood smoke and approaching winter, where your breath clouded before your face and the sunlight seemed thin and watery, unable to warm the earth it touched. She'd come by coach from Louisville, a bone-rattling 12-hour journey through increasingly rugged terrain, watching civilization fall away with each passing mile until they were in country that seemed older than America itself. Ancient limestone ridges crowned with oak and hickory that had stood since before the first white men pushed through Cumberland Gap. The other passengers had regarded her with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. A young woman traveling alone to a place even locals spoke of in hushed tones. The Hollow, they said, had a reputation. For what, they wouldn't quite specify, just that look, that sidelong glance that suggested some knowledge they preferred not to voice. She'd been hired by the county board to assist Miss Agatha Crane, the schoolmistress who had run the Hollow's only school for orphaned and destitute children for nearly 15 years. A tenure that in itself should have been remarkable but somehow wasn't talked about much in Louisville's educational circles. The position had been advertised in the Louisville Courier with surprising urgency, the notice appearing 3 weeks running with an escalating offer of salary $25 a month, then $30, then $35. Sums generous enough to raise eyebrows among Margaret's fellow teachers at the Girls' Academy, where she'd completed her certificate. Why would they pay so much for a position in a hollow? Her friend Caroline had asked, practical as always. What aren't they telling you? But Margaret, 22 years old and burning with a need to prove herself beyond the suffocating confines of her father's tobacco plantation, hadn't wanted to hear caution. She wanted adventure, purpose, the chance to make a difference in young lives. She wanted desperately to be free of the gilded cage that was Southern womanhood, the endless tea parties and needlepoint and discussions of weather and appropriate hemlines. She wanted to matter. Freedom, she'd thought then, with the certainty of youth, was worth any price. She'd learn in time just how expensive freedom truly was and who really paid its cost. The Hollow itself was a scar in the Kentucky landscape, a geological depression carved between limestone ridges by some ancient catastrophe of water and time. Morning mist clung to it like cobwebs, thick and persistent, sometimes not burning off until mid-afternoon. The autumn sun struggled to penetrate the perpetual gloom, and even at midday the Hollow seemed dimmer than it should be, as though the land itself held onto shadows. The settlement that bore the Hollow's name consisted of perhaps 40 structures, most of them rough cabins of pine and chestnut, though there were a few more substantial buildings, a general store that also served as post office, a blacksmith's forge where the ring of hammer on anvil provided the Hollow's primary sound, a church that had seen better days, its steeple listing slightly to the north as though recoiling from some unseen threat. And at the settlement's eastern edge, where the hollow began its upward climb toward the ridge, stood the schoolhouse. Miss Crane greeted Margaret at the schoolhouse door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was a woman of perhaps 50, though hardship had a way of aging people prematurely in these mountain settlements. Her dress was impeccably clean, black as morning, and her greying hair was pulled back so severely that it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Her hands, Margaret noticed, were beautiful, pale and delicate, with long fingers that moved with the precision of a pianist. "Miss Holloway," Agatha said, her voice soft as velvet over steel. How prompt. Punctuality is the first virtue of a proper educator. She stepped aside, gesturing Margaret into the single large room that served as the school. "The children are at their morning lessons. I trust you'll find them exceptionally well behaved." That was an understatement. As Margaret walked down the center aisle, not a single child turned to look at her. They stared at their slate boards with the fixed attention of soldiers at attention. A girl of perhaps 10 had a bit of drool collecting at the corner of her mouth. A boy near the back swayed slightly in his seat, catching himself, swaying again. "They seem tired," Margaret ventured, keeping her voice neutral. "Children of their station are unaccustomed to the rigors of education," Agatha replied, moving to her desk at the front of the room. "Many arrive here having never sat still for more than a few moments. I've found that a strict regimen and proper nutrition work wonders for settling their natural wildness." She lifted a small bell from her desk and rang it once, clear and sharp. "Children, greet your new teacher." In perfect unison, 23 voices murmured, "Good morning, Miss Holloway," then fell immediately silent again. The sound was eerie in its precision, like a music box playing a single note. Margaret's unease deepened, but she smiled brightly. "Good morning, children. I'm very pleased to meet you all." No response, not even a flicker of curiosity in those glazed eyes. Over the following days, Margaret began to understand the routine that governed the Ravens Hollow School. The children arrived at dawn, trudging in a silent line from the orphanage to the schoolhouse, regardless of weather. They sat through morning lessons, mathematics and reading, without fidgeting or whispering. At noon, they filed into a small dining hall attached to the school, where Agatha personally distributed their lunch, always the same: thick slices of dark bread, a cup of weak broth, sometimes an apple. The bread Agatha tore from fresh loaves herself, her beautiful hands breaking the crust with careful deliberation, and Margaret noticed she always gave each child their portion directly, watching to ensure they ate every crumb. After lunch, the children grew even more lethargic. Afternoon lessons were a farce. Many could barely hold their heads up. Some dozed openly at their desks. Agatha ignored this completely, continuing her instruction in that soft, relentless voice, speaking of history and grammar to an audience that could barely focus their eyes. "Don't they seem unwell?" Margaret asked one afternoon, after the children had shuffled back to the orphanage for the evening. Agatha was tidying her desk, arranging papers with meticulous care. "Children of poverty often suffer from weak constitutions. The bread we serve is specially enriched. I prepare it myself with various tonics and healthful supplements. It takes time, but proper nutrition will strengthen them." "Oh, what sort of tonics?" "Oh, various things. Molasses for iron, herbs for vigor." Agatha's smile was pleasant, but her eyes were hard. "You needn't trouble yourself with the specifics, Miss Holloway. I've been caring for these children long before you arrived, and I dare say I'll continue long after you've moved on to wherever young women of your ambition go next." There was something in the way she said it, a subtle threat wrapped in pleasantry that made Margaret's spine stiffen. But she was 22 years old, new to teaching, and Agatha Crane was an established figure in the community. Who was she to question? Yet she couldn't shake her disquiet. She began watching more carefully. The children were silent, yes, but it was more than mere obedience. It was absence. They moved like sleepwalkers, spoke in monotones when called upon, showed no joy, no fear, no anger, nothing. And they were always hungry in the mornings, desperate for that noon bread, reaching for it with trembling hands. One evening, Margaret stayed late, grading papers by lamplight. Through the thin wall that separated the schoolroom from the dining hall, she heard Agatha moving about, the creak of floorboards, the scrape of a chair. Curious, she set down her pen and quietly approached the connecting door, which stood slightly ajar. Agatha stood at the rough wooden table, her back to the door. Before her was a large earthenware bowl filled with torn bread. From a brown glass bottle, she was carefully pouring a dark liquid over the bread, tilting the bottle to ensure even coverage. The liquid was thick, viscous, and as it soaked into the bread, the pieces darkened to the color of old blood. Agatha worked with intense concentration, her beautiful hands steady, her lips moving silently as though counting drops. When she finished, she stoppered the bottle and tucked it into a locked cabinet on the wall, pocketing the key. Margaret stepped back from the door, her heart hammering. She recognized that bottle's shape, brown glass, narrow neck, the kind that held laudanum. Opium dissolved in alcohol. Every household in Kentucky had a bottle tucked away for toothaches and coughs, but this was something else entirely. The quantity Agatha had poured, the methodical preparation, the secrecy of it. Margaret felt coldness spreading through her chest. The next morning, she arrived early, before the children. Agatha was already there, setting out the soaked bread on plates, arranging them with her usual precision. "Good morning, Miss Holloway," Agatha said without looking up. "You're here early." "I wanted to help with preparations," Margaret said, keeping her voice light. She moved closer to the table, looking at the bread. Up close, she could smell it, that distinctive, sweet, bitter scent that clung to sick rooms. "This bread looks different from yesterday's. I prepare it fresh each morning, special recipe." Agatha finally looked at her, and there was something new in her expression, a calculation, an assessment. "You seem troubled, Miss Holloway. Is the position not to your satisfaction?" "I'm concerned about the children's lethargy. As I said, weak constitutions. Perhaps the bread's special ingredients are making them drowsy." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Agatha set down the plate she was holding with exaggerated care. When she spoke, her voice had lost all its velvet softness. "Miss Holloway, I'm going to be very clear with you. These children come to us from the worst circumstances imaginable: beatings, starvation, abuse I won't dignify by describing. They arrive wild, violent, impossible to teach. My methods calm them. My methods allow them to learn, to become productive members of society rather than the criminal element they would otherwise become. Do you understand? By drugging them? By saving them?" Agatha's composure cracked slightly, her voice rising. "By giving them peace. Do you know what these children would face otherwise? The workhouses, the factories, the streets. At least here they're fed, sheltered, educated. The small price of their compliance is nothing compared to the alternative. That's not education. That's imprisonment." Agatha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're very young, Miss Holloway. Very idealistic. You speak of freedom as though it's something these children have ever known or could ever achieve. I give them what they need: order and calm and sustenance. Their gratitude is their silence. Their silence is coerced. Their silence is survival." Agatha stepped closer, and Margaret saw something dangerous flicker behind those cold eyes. "I've spent 15 years building this school, ensuring these unwanted children don't become society's burden. The county board supports my methods. The town supports my methods. Who do you think they'll believe? A decorated educator with 15 years of service, or a girl fresh from her father's plantation playing at teacher? The threat was explicit now. Margaret felt her brief burst of courage deflating. Agatha was right. She had no power here, no allies. She was alone. But that night, lying in her small rented room above the general store, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept seeing those glazed eyes, those trembling hands reaching for poisoned bread. She thought about freedom, the freedom she'd sought in coming here, and realized how naive she'd been. Freedom wasn't just escape from one's own circumstances. Real freedom meant ensuring others weren't enslaved. She began documenting everything. Each day she noted which children seemed most affected, how long the lethargy lasted, any symptoms beyond drowsiness. She noted the amounts Agatha prepared, the timing of doses. She stole a piece of the soaked bread, wrapping it carefully in cloth, evidence. She wrote letters to the county board, to newspapers in Louisville, to anyone who might listen, describing what she witnessed. The responses, when they came, were dismissive. The county board praised Miss Crane's innovative methods for handling difficult children. The newspapers never replied. One board member did write back, a curt note informing Margaret that women of emotional temperament were sometimes unsuited for the challenging work of educating the poor, and suggesting she might consider returning to domestic life. Margaret's isolation deepened. The townspeople of Ravens Hollow avoided her eyes when she walked through the settlement. Shopkeepers served her in stony silence. She realized Agatha had been talking, spreading some story about her, poisoning the well before Margaret could draw from it. But the children, she noticed, were beginning to wake up. Subtly, gradually, as though she'd been reducing the dosage, Agatha's victims were becoming more present. A boy named Thomas started fidgeting. A girl named Sarah began humming quietly during arithmetic. They were still far from normal, still deeply affected, but consciousness was returning. Margaret didn't understand until she found the note on her desk one morning, written in Agatha's precise hand. "Your interference has been noted. Adjustments are being made. The children will be transferred to the county workhouse in Louisville at month's end, where I'm assured they'll receive appropriate management for their unruly natures. I trust you're pleased with your meddling." The workhouse. Margaret had heard stories about the Louisville workhouse, about children as young as 6 working 16-hour days in textile mills, about accidents and illnesses and death rates that made even hardened men wince. It was effectively a death sentence. Just slower and more profitable than outright murder. Agatha was calling her bluff. Either Margaret could back down, allow the Laudanum routine to continue, and at least the children would remain here, docile but alive. Or she could persist, and Agatha would simply remove the problem, send the children to Louisville, where their fate would be out of everyone's hands and consciences. It was a devil's bargain, and Agatha knew it. This was what power looked like, Margaret realized. Not the formal power of law and position, though Agatha had that too, but the deeper power of being willing to do harm, to sacrifice others for one's vision of order. That night, Margaret made her decision. She would document everything thoroughly, gather irrefutable evidence, and then she would act, regardless of cost, to herself. If the authorities wouldn't listen, she would make them listen. If the town wouldn't help, she would find help elsewhere. Freedom, she understood now, wasn't free. It was bought with courage and sacrifice, paid for in sleepless nights, and the knowledge that failure meant not just personal defeat, but the continued suffering of 23 children who had no other advocate. She began by befriending the few allies she could find in Ravens Hollow. Those souls who hadn't yet been completely cowed by Agatha's influence, or who harbored their own doubts about the schoolmistress's methods. Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry service on the edge of town, was the first to speak to her in anything more than monosyllables. Mrs. Chen was a small woman, Chinese by birth, though she'd lived in Kentucky for 20 years, brought over initially to work on the railroad and staying after her husband died in a blasting accident. She washed clothes in enormous cast-iron tubs behind her small cabin, her hands perpetually reddened and chapped from lye soap and hot water, and she had a son who died 5 years earlier in the Louisville workhouse, crushed between machinery in a textile mill at the age of 11. The Hollows residents used her services but rarely spoke to her beyond the necessities of business, the casual racism of the era keeping her isolated despite her decades of residence. They spoke in fragments at first, careful whispers shared over folded linens and the rhythmic splash of washing. "Something wrong there," Mrs. Chen said one afternoon, nodding toward the schoolhouse visible through her cabin's single window. "Always was. Since first day Miss Crane came. Children used to have life, you know. Used to hear them playing sometimes, fighting, making noise like children should. Then she came with her special bread, her tonics and disciplines, and the noise stopped. Stopped completely, like someone put blanket over whole school." She paused in her scrubbing, her dark eyes distant with memory. "My boy, before he went to workhouse, he had friend here. Thomas Riley, 8 years old then. Thomas told my boy about the bread, how it made everything soft and far away, how Miss Crane said it was medicine to make them good. Thomas said he didn't want to be good if good meant feeling like he was drowning in warm water all the time. But he ate the bread anyway. They all did. What choice they had." "What happened to Thomas?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Mrs. Chen shook her head. "Don't know. One day he was there. Next day Miss Crane said he'd been sent to live with farming family in Lexington. Lucky boy, she said, found good home. But no one ever got letter from him. No one ever saw him again. And my boy, before he died, he told me he had bad dreams about Thomas. Dreams about crying in the dark, under the ground." She looked directly at Margaret then, her weathered face grave. "Something wrong there, always was. But who listens to Chinese woman? Who listens to anyone against Miss Crane? She got friends, Miss Holloway, people who owe her, people who profit from orphanage being here, from donations that come from rich families in Louisville who want to feel good about helping poor children. No one wants to look too close at what that help really means." "I'm listening," Margaret said quietly, "and I'm going to do something about it." "You be careful, girl," Mrs. Chen warned, her voice dropping even lower. "Miss Crane, she don't forgive people who cause problems. Last teacher who asked questions, Miss Warren, she got run out of town. Accused of theft, reputation destroyed, can't get teaching position anywhere now. And before that, there was man, Mr. Hollister. He was county inspector, came to look at orphanage conditions. He found something, Margaret could tell, something that troubled him deeply. He went back to Louisville, saying he needed to file report. Week later, he had accident. Fell downstairs, broke his neck. Maybe was accident, maybe not. Who can say? But message was clear, you understand? Don't look too close. Don't ask too many questions. But Mrs. Chen also gave Margaret something invaluable. Names, people who might help, who tried to help before and been rebuffed but might try again if given new evidence, new reasons. A doctor in Lexington, Dr. Samuel Whitmore, who'd refused to supply Agatha with laudanum 3 years ago after she'd requested quantities he found suspicious. He'd reported her to the medical board, but nothing had come of it. The board apparently satisfied with Agatha's explanation that she was treating an epidemic of children's coughs. A minister, Reverend Jonathan Hayes, who'd served Ravens Hollow's church for 2 years before leaving abruptly, telling people he was called to missionary work, but confiding to a few that he couldn't stay in a place where children's suffering was systematically ignored. A former teacher, Elizabeth Warren, the woman Mrs. Chen had mentioned, who'd been dismissed 3 years before Margaret arrived under circumstances that remained murky, but involved accusations of impropriety that no one quite believed. But everyone repeated anyway, because the alternative was confronting uncomfortable questions about Agatha Crane. Margaret wrote to all of them, careful, detailed letters laying out everything she'd observed, everything she'd documented. She described the children's glazed eyes, their unnatural lethargy, their desperate hunger for the noon bread. She described Agatha's ritual of preparation, the brown bottle, the careful dosing. She included sketches she'd made of the children at different times of day, showing the progression from morning alertness, relatively speaking, to post-lunch stupor to evening near catatonia. She wrote about Thomas and the other children who disappeared, about the locked cabinet where Agatha kept her bottles, about the root cellar beneath the orphanage that no one was allowed to enter. The responses, when they came, were mixed, but collectively painted a picture more disturbing than Margaret had imagined. Dr. Whitmore wrote back immediately, a long letter describing his suspicions about Agatha's requests for laudanum. She'd wanted amounts, he said, that would stock a hospital, not treat occasional childhood ailments. When he'd refused, she'd found another supplier, someone less scrupulous or more easily convinced by her explanations. But what troubled him more, he wrote, was the pattern. Every few years, according to medical supply records he'd discreetly investigated, there would be a spike in laudanum purchases in Ravens Hollow's area, quantities that far exceeded what any reasonable medical practice would require. The spikes corresponded roughly with the arrival of new batches of children to the orphanage. It suggested, he said carefully, choosing his words with medical precision, a systematic program of chemical control rather than isolated incidents of inappropriate medication. Reverend Hayes's response was anguished and guilt-ridden. He'd known something was wrong, he wrote. He'd seen it in the children's faces during the few times Agatha had brought them to Sunday services before she'd stopped attending altogether, claiming the walk was too difficult for children of delicate health. He'd seen it in the way they sat absolutely motionless through his sermons, never fidgeting the way normal children did, never whispering or giggling or needing to be shushed. He'd questioned Agatha privately, asked if the children were well, if they were receiving adequate care. She'd assured him they were, had explained about their difficult backgrounds, their need for structure and calm. He'd wanted to believe her, he admitted. It was easier to believe her, to accept that someone was handling a difficult problem in the best way possible, than to confront the alternative. But he'd had dreams, he wrote, terrible dreams about children calling for help from somewhere deep underground. And he'd woken one night certain he heard crying coming from the direction of the orphanage. He'd gone to investigate, found nothing, but the next morning Agatha had been colder to him, more distant, and he'd realized somehow she'd known he'd been there, had perhaps even been watching. He'd left Ravens Hollow shortly after, telling himself it was God's call to other work, but knowing, in his heart, that it was cowardice. He offered to help Margaret however he could, including testifying if she could bring the matter to legal proceedings, but he cautioned that Agatha was protected by powerful people, people who valued the appearance of charity more than its reality. Elizabeth Warren's letter was the most damning and the most heartbreaking. She'd been hired, like Margaret, to assist Agatha with teaching, she wrote, and like Margaret, she'd noticed immediately that something was wrong with the children. But she'd been young, 20 years old, and intimidated by Agatha's reputation and the town's deference to her. She'd kept quiet for nearly a year, watching the children deteriorate, watching new arrivals transform from lively, if damaged, youngsters into the same glazed automatons as their predecessors. Then one of her students, a girl named Annie, who was 9 years old, had managed to speak to Elizabeth privately, had told her about the bread, about how it made her feel like she was sinking into warm honey, about how she wanted to stop eating it, but Miss Crane made sure everyone ate their portion, watched them swallow every bite. Elizabeth had confronted Agatha, demanded to know what was in the bread. Agatha had been dismissive at first, then angry, then threatening. 2 days later, money had gone missing from the school supply fund, money Elizabeth was responsible for tracking. Agatha had discovered the theft, she'd said, with great reluctance and sadness, had hoped to handle it quietly to spare Elizabeth's family embarrassment, but she couldn't in good conscience allow someone of questionable character to continue working with vulnerable children. Elizabeth had been dismissed, her reputation destroyed with carefully crafted rumors about moral weakness and sticky fingers. No school would hire her after that. She'd ended up working as a seamstress in Cincinnati, barely making enough to survive, her dreams of teaching children destroyed by her attempt to help them. "I should have fought harder," Elizabeth wrote. "I should have screamed from rooftops, gone to newspapers, made such a fuss that someone would have had to listen. But I was afraid and young, and I believed that surely someone with more authority, more power would step in. I believed that truth mattered more than reputation, that children's welfare mattered more than keeping secrets. I was wrong. And Annie, that little girl who trusted me enough to speak the truth. She disappeared 3 months after I left, adopted out, Agatha said, to a nice family in Tennessee. But I wrote to every adoption society in Tennessee, tried to trace her, and found nothing. It's as though she never existed." Margaret read these letters by candlelight in her small room, feeling the weight of them, the accumulated sorrow and guilt and thwarted good intentions, but she also felt something else, determination, because now she wasn't alone. Now she had witnesses, documentation, a pattern that extended beyond one person's observations. Now she had proof that Agatha Crane was not an isolated case of misguided discipline, but a systematic predator who'd been operating for years with impunity, protected by people who valued order over justice and silence over truth. She began compiling a comprehensive report, bringing together her own observations, the letters from her allies, medical information about laudanum's effects and appropriate dosages, testimonies from Mrs. Chen and others in the town who'd noticed the children's deterioration. It took her 3 weeks, working late every night after the school day ended, filling pages with careful documentation, cross-referencing facts, building an irrefutable case. When she finished, she had a document 50 pages long that laid out in methodical detail exactly what was happening at Ravens Hollow School for the improvement of destitute children and exactly who was responsible. She made 3 copies. One she sent to the Louisville Courier, Kentucky's largest newspaper, with a cover letter explaining the urgency of the situation. One she sent to the State Board of Education with a demand for immediate investigation, and one she kept for herself, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room, insurance against whatever might happen next. But Margaret kept gathering evidence. She managed to steal not just a piece of the tainted bread, but the actual bottle of laudanum, replacing it in Agatha's cabinet with an identical bottle filled with harmless herbal tea. She documented the dosages, calculated from what she'd observed, and they were staggering, enough to stupefy the children completely, doses that would addict them within weeks and kill them within years. Agatha noticed the substitution immediately, of course. One morning, Margaret arrived to find the schoolhouse locked, a note pinned to the door. "Your services are no longer required. Final payment will be forwarded to your address." Just like that, she was dismissed. No hearing, no chance to defend herself. Agatha's power was absolute, but Margaret didn't leave Ravens Hollow. She stayed in her small room, writing frantically, compiling her evidence into a comprehensive report. She sent copies to every newspaper in Kentucky, to abolition societies who might care about the exploitation of children, to religious organizations, to anyone with a platform. Most ignored her. Some replied with sympathy but no action. The world, she discovered, had infinite capacity for looking away from uncomfortable truths. Then, 3 weeks after her dismissal, something unexpected happened. Thomas, the boy who'd begun fidgeting, ran away from the orphanage. He made it as far as Mrs. Chen's laundry before collapsing, his small body racked with chills and nausea, symptoms of laudanum withdrawal. Mrs. Chen hid him in her back room and sent for Margaret. The boy was in agony, sweating and shaking, begging for the bread, the special bread that made everything soft and far away. Margaret held his hand while Mrs. Chen brought cool cloths and what comfort they could offer. Through his delirium, Thomas told them fragments of the full horror. The orphanage wasn't just a school. Children who caused trouble, who resisted too much, who tried to tell visitors the truth about their condition. Those children disappeared. Sent to family farms, Agatha would say, adopted out. But Thomas had seen things, heard things. There was a root cellar beneath the orphanage, old and deep, and sometimes at night there were sounds from below, scratching and crying that stopped by morning. "She says we're being saved," Thomas whispered, his young face ancient with knowledge no child should carry. "She says we should be grateful, that we're learning to be still, to be good, to not burden anyone. But miss, I don't want to be still. I want to run. I want to yell. I want to be alive." Those words broke something in Margaret. This wasn't just about stopping Agatha. It was about the fundamental question of what freedom meant, whether these children, poor and orphaned and considered society's refuse, whether they had the same right to liberty, to wildness, to life as anyone else. She made a decision that would either save them or destroy her completely. She would go to the orphanage herself, openly, and she would demand to see every child, every room, including that root cellar. She would create a confrontation so public that silence would be impossible. Mrs. Chen tried to stop her. "They'll hurt you, girl. They'll hurt you bad." "Let them," Margaret said. "Let them do it where people can see." The next morning, Margaret walked to the orphanage accompanied by Mrs. Chen, Thomas, and a few others she'd managed to convince, a small group of townspeople who'd grown troubled by the children's condition, by the whispers and rumors, by their own suppressed guilt. It wasn't many, perhaps 7 people, but it was enough to constitute witnesses. Agatha met them at the door, her face a mask of pleasant confusion. "Miss Holloway, how unexpected. And you've brought friends." "I'm here to see the children, all of them." "That's highly irregular. The children are at their lessons." "Then we'll see them at their lessons." Something flickered in Agatha's eyes, a calculation. Behind her, Margaret could see the schoolhouse, could hear nothing from inside, that terrible silence. "I'm afraid I must ask you to leave. You're trespassing." "We're not leaving until we see the children. Then I'll send for the sheriff." "Please do," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "I have quite a lot to discuss with him." They stood there in standoff, and Margaret could see Agatha calculating, weighing options. The schoolmistress was protected, yes, but not invincible. Scandal could still hurt her. Public confrontation was dangerous. Finally, Agatha stepped aside with a cold smile. "Very well. Though I warn you, you'll be disappointed. The children are perfectly healthy and content." Margaret pushed past her into the schoolhouse, and what she saw stopped her breath. The children were there, yes, 23 of them, but they were arranged like dolls on display. They sat in perfect rows, hands folded, faces blank, and not one of them reacted to the intrusion. They simply stared ahead, seeing nothing, being nothing. "As you can see," Agatha said from behind her, "all is well." But Thomas broke free from Mrs. Chen's hand and ran to the children, shaking one girl's shoulder. "Sarah! Sarah! Wake up!" The girl didn't respond. Thomas tried another, then another, his voice rising to a scream. "Wake up! Please wake up!" They were too deeply drugged to respond, or they'd been dosed with something stronger, some final solution to the problem Margaret represented. She turned to Agatha, who stood in the doorway, backlit by autumn sun, And in that moment she saw the woman clearly. Not a villain in a melodrama, but something worse, something more mundane. Someone who'd convinced herself that control was kindness, that silence was peace, that crushing the spirit was salvation. "What have you done?" Margaret whispered. "What was necessary?" Agatha's voice was calm. "These children were broken long before they came to me. I simply finished the process, made them useful, made them quiet. The world doesn't want them wild and free, Miss Holloway. The world wants them obedient and invisible. I provide what the world wants. You provide death. I provide purpose." Agatha stepped forward, and for the first time, Margaret saw true belief in her face, a zealot's certainty. "You speak of freedom, but you don't understand what that means for children like these. Freedom to starve, freedom to freeze in winter, freedom to be exploited by anyone strong enough to take what they want from them. I give them structure, I give them safety. The price is their will, yes, but what use is will without power?" It was a philosophy of oppression dressed as care, and Margaret realized with horror that Agatha genuinely believed it. She'd spent 15 years building this system, had been praised and funded for it, and in her mind, she was the hero of this story, saving children from worse fates through stern discipline and chemical control. "They're human beings," Margaret said. "They deserve the chance to be themselves, even if that self is loud and wild and difficult. They deserve to survive. Everything else is luxury." The sheriff arrived then, summoned by one of Agatha's allies, a heavy-set man named Porter, who'd been taking payments from the orphanage budget for years. He listened to Agatha's version first, nodding along, then turned to Margaret with the expression of a man who'd already decided how this would end. "Miss Holloway, you're disturbing the peace. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "These children are being drugged," Margaret said, holding up the bottle of laudanum she'd stolen. "With this, heavily, daily, I have documentation, witnesses, evidence." Porter barely glanced at the bottle. "Miss Crane has explained her methods, special tonics for special needs, all approved by the county board, approved by people who profit from looking the other way." "Careful, miss, that's slanderous talk." But Thomas hadn't stopped trying to wake the other children, and now some of them were stirring, responding to his touch, his voice, his living presence breaking through the chemical fog. One girl, Sarah, blinked and turned her head, and her eyes focused on Thomas, then Margaret. And then she began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere profound. "I don't want to be still," Sarah wept. "I'm so tired of being still." Other children began crying too, the sound spreading through the room like contagion. 15 years of suppressed emotion breaking through the laudanum's hold. They reached for each other, clutched at Thomas, at Margaret, at anything real and warm and alive. They wailed and screamed, and some of them vomited from the intensity of it, their small bodies rejecting the docility that had been forced into them. Sheriff Porter looked shaken. Whatever he'd been paid, whatever he'd believed, this scene was harder to ignore. These were children in agony, undeniably, visibly suffering. "Miss Crane," he said slowly, "maybe you'd better explain those tonics again." But Agatha was backing away, her composure finally cracking. "They're hysterical. This is exactly why they need management. Look at them, wild and uncontrolled. This is what I've been preventing." "This is what you've been causing," Margaret said. She turned to the sheriff, speaking quickly before her courage failed. "Look at them. Really look. They're not hysterical. They're human. They're children being allowed to feel for the first time in months, maybe years. What you've been calling peace was just absence. What you've been calling order was just oppression." Porter looked at the children, at Agatha, at the bottle of laudanum in Margaret's hand, and something shifted in his expression. Maybe it was conscience. Maybe it was just the recognition that this had become too public to cover up. "Either way," he said, "Miss Crane, I think we need to have a conversation down at my office." What happened next took weeks to unfold, but the core of it was simple. Once the silence was broken, it couldn't be re-established. Margaret's documentation, combined with the physical evidence of the laudanum, combined with the testimony of the children themselves as they emerged from their chemical prison, was enough to bring charges. Not criminal charges. Kentucky in 1856 had few laws protecting children but civil ones. Misappropriation of funds, fraud, breach of contract with the county board. Agatha fought, of course. She hired lawyers, called in favors, painted herself as a martyred educator being persecuted by an hysterical young woman and ungrateful children. Some people believed her. The town split viciously, neighbors turning against neighbors over the question of what had happened in that schoolhouse, what should be done about it, whether silence and order weren't perhaps preferable to the messy reality of children being allowed to be children. The orphanage was shut down. The children were dispersed to other institutions, other towns, and Margaret tried not to think about whether those places were any better. She'd saved them from Agatha, but she hadn't saved them from poverty, from being unwanted, from a society that viewed their existence as a problem to be managed rather than lives to be nurtured. Agatha herself disappeared. Some said she moved west to California, where land was cheap and questions were few. Others claimed she'd gone south to Georgia or Alabama, where methods of control were even more entrenched, and laudanum would be the least of anyone's concerns. Margaret heard a rumor years later that a schoolmistress matching Agatha's description was running an asylum for the feeble-minded in St. Louis. But she never confirmed it, wasn't sure she wanted to know. As for the root cellar beneath the orphanage, when they finally opened it, they found nothing, just dirt and darkness and the lingering smell of damp earth. Whatever secrets it had held, Agatha had made sure to clean them away before the investigation reached that far. But Margaret knew, Thomas knew, they all knew that some children had gone down there and never come up, had been declared adopted or transferred or simply forgotten in record-keeping errors, as though a child's life could be erased with nothing more than missing paperwork. The school building stood empty for a year, then burned down in an electrical fire that everyone agreed was probably accidental, but nobody investigated very hard. The town wanted to forget, wanted to return to whatever version of normalcy had existed before Margaret Holloway arrived, with her questions and her conscience. Margaret stayed in Ravens Hollow for 3 more years, teaching what children remained in a new schoolhouse built on the other side of town. She never used so much as a willow switch for discipline, let alone laudanum. Her students were loud, chaotic, sometimes difficult, and she loved them fiercely for it. Loved their wildness, their stubborn refusal to be still, their absolute determination to be seen and heard. But the weight of what she'd witnessed, what she'd fought against, what she'd only partially stopped, wore her down. She began having nightmares, seeing those glazed eyes, hearing that terrible silence. She'd wake up gasping, certain she could smell that sweet, bitter scent of laudanum-soaked bread. In 1859, she left Kentucky, went north to Ohio, where the air felt cleaner and the past felt farther away. She continued teaching, became involved in abolition work, fought against another form of enforced silence and control. When the war came, she volunteered as a nurse, and in the field hospitals, surrounded by the wounded and dying, she often thought about Agatha Crane's philosophy, about how people justified controlling others for their own good, about how easily cruelty disguised itself as care. She never married, never had children of her own, but she stayed in touch with some of the orphans she'd helped free, the ones who'd survived and managed to build lives. Thomas became a carpenter, good with his hands, proud of his work. Sarah married a farmer and had 5 loud, energetic children who she never ever told to be still. A few others wrote to her over the years, brief notes describing their lives, thanking her, asking if she remembered them. She remembered. She would always remember. In 1893, near the end of her life, Margaret wrote a memoir. She called it The Silence That Haunts, and she dedicated it to the children of Ravens Hollow, both those who'd survived and those who hadn't. She wrote about Agatha Crane without hatred, which surprised even her. Instead, she wrote about how ordinary evil could be, how it could wear the face of respectability and convince itself of its own righteousness, how the worst oppression often came from those who believed they were helping. But mostly, she wrote about freedom and what it really meant, not just the absence of chains, physical or chemical, but the presence of choice, of voice, of the right to be inconvenient and loud and imperfectly human. She wrote about how society always wanted to silence its most vulnerable members, to make them still and quiet and manageable, and how that silence was a kind of death, slower than poison, but just as final. The memoir was published by a small press and read by almost no one. Apparently, even decades later, people didn't want to hear about drugged orphans and the woman who'd fed them poisoned bread while calling it salvation. It was too uncomfortable, too accusatory, too pointed in its questions about who else was being silenced, who else was being controlled for their own supposed good. But occasionally, Margaret would receive a letter from someone who had read it, often a teacher, sometimes a social worker or reformer. They would write about children they'd seen in institutions, behavior they'd questioned, patterns they'd noticed. They would ask for advice, for courage, for permission to make trouble. Margaret always wrote back the same thing. Trust what you see. Speak what you know. Accept that you may lose everything and do it anyway, because silence protects the powerful, and freedom requires noise. When she died in 1899 at the age of 65, her obituary in the Cincinnati newspaper was 3 lines long and mentioned nothing about Ravens Hollow. But at her funeral, 13 people showed up who'd been children in that schoolhouse, who'd survived the Laudanum and the workhouses and the wars and the poverty and all the other silence makers the world had thrown at them. They stood around her grave, and before the coffin was lowered, they made noise. They laughed and argued and told stories and shouted and sang badly, and let themselves be exactly as messy and human and alive as people deserved to be. It was the tribute Margaret would have wanted, not silence and propriety, but noise and life and the absolute refusal to be still. The town of Ravens Hollow no longer exists. The hollow itself was flooded in the 1930s when they built a dam on the Cumberland River, and now it's just water, deep and cold and quiet. Occasionally, when the reservoir is low, you can see foundations, the ghost outlines of buildings, and locals will tell you that's where the old orphanage used to be. They don't tell the rest of the story, though. That's been forgotten or suppressed or filed away in archives nobody reads. The county records from 1856 mention a Miss Agatha Crane who ran a school, and they mention some kind of scandal, but the details are vague. The handwriting difficult to read, the pages damaged by water and time, but the story persists in fragments, the way trauma always does. In Kentucky, there are teachers who talk about the importance of active classrooms, who distrust too much obedience, who question any system that makes children unnaturally docile. They don't always know why they feel that way, what historical lesson they're unconsciously heeding. But it's there, passed down through professional culture and cautionary tales. And sometimes, in antique stores and estate sales, you can find small brown bottles, the kind that used to hold laudanum. Most people buy them for decoration, thinking they're charming relics of simpler times, but occasionally someone will pick one up and feel a chill, an unaccountable discomfort, and they'll put it back down quickly, wiping their hands on their clothes as though they'd touched something contaminated. The silence that haunts Kentucky has texture to it, if you know how to listen. It's in the gaps in county records, the missing pages in school registries, the unmarked graves in potters' fields. It's in all the children whose names were never properly recorded, whose lives were considered too insignificant to document, who disappeared into America's vast machinery of forgetting. But it's also in the resistance to that silence, in the teachers who refuse to make their students still, in the writers who tell uncomfortable stories, in everyone who insists that freedom isn't just the absence of chains, but the presence of voice, even when that voice is inconvenient, even when it disturbs the peace, even when it forces us to confront what we'd rather ignore. Margaret Holloway fought one woman, in one town, in 1 year. She saved some children and lost others. She never brought Agatha Crane to real justice, never got the recognition she deserved, never saw the systemic changes she hoped for. In the grand scope of history, she was a minor figure, a footnote, barely remembered. But she made noise when silence was easier. She chose freedom over order. She looked at 23 drugged children and saw not problems to be managed, but human beings deserving of wildness and life. That matters. It always matters, even when the hollow floods and the buildings sink and the names fade from memory, even when the story gets reduced to fragments and rumors and unexplained chills when handling old bottles. Even then, the choice she made matters, because someone has to remember that silence isn't peace. Someone has to insist that order isn't worth the price of freedom. Someone has to be willing to make trouble, to make noise, to disturb the comfortable quiet that allows oppression to continue unseen. Someone has to refuse to be still. The water is quiet now over Raven's Hollow, smooth and reflective, pretty in the Kentucky sunlight. Boaters cross it without knowing what lies beneath. Swimmers splash in summer, not realizing they're playing above the drowned ruins of a place where children were chemically silenced for their own supposed good. But sometimes locals will tell you, when the reservoir is very still at dawn or dusk, when the light hits just right and the water turns dark as old blood, sometimes you can hear something, not ghosts, nothing so melodramatic, just sound, distant and unclear. That might be wind in the trees, or might be something else. Might be voices, children's voices, finally allowed to be loud. It's probably nothing, almost certainly nothing. The rational explanation is always wind and water, and the human tendency to hear patterns in randomness. But those who lived through Raven's Hollow's history, who remember the scandal, even if they don't talk about it, they know what they hear in that sound. It's the noise Margaret Holloway fought for, the wildness she protected, the freedom she chose over every other consideration. It's the sound of children refusing to be still. And that sound, whether real or imagined, whether wind or memory or something that exists in the space between, that sound is hope. Hope that silence can be broken. Hope that oppression can be resisted. Hope that even the most powerless people have worth, have voice, have the fundamental right to make noise and take up space and insist on their humanity. That's the real legacy of what happened in Raven's Hollow. Not Agatha Crane's philosophy of control, though that persists too in 1,000 forms. Not the scandal and its sordid details, though those have educational value. But the simple act of one person looking at injustice and saying no, saying this is wrong, saying I will not be quiet even if it costs me everything. Margaret Holloway didn't save the world. She didn't even save all the children in one small hollow in Kentucky, but she saved some. She made noise when silence was demanded. She chose freedom when control was easier. In the end, maybe that's all any of us can do. Look at the silence around us, the comfortable quiet that hides uncomfortable truths, and decide to disturb it. Make noise, ask questions, refuse to accept that order is worth the price of freedom, that peace is worth the price of oppression, that quiet is worth the price of human dignity. The hollow is flooded now, but the story isn't drowned. It's here in this telling, and in every other time someone refuses to let the powerful write the only version of history. It's alive in every loud classroom, every noisy protest, every inconvenient question that disturbs the peace. It's alive in everyone who refuses to be still. And that refusal, that noise, that absolute insistence on being heard, even when silence would be safer, that's not just resistance, that's freedom. The messy, difficult, essential freedom that Margaret Holloway fought for and Agatha Crane tried to destroy. That's the freedom that haunts Kentucky, and thank God it does. Thank God some ghosts are loud.